Let's return now to our panel on the special edition of the Newsmakers. And joining the discussion now is Gulnur Aybet, a professor in political science who specializes in NATO. And still with us in London is the Times former Moscow correspondent Michael Binyon. And in Moscow is Maxim Shepovalenko, a research fellow at the Center for Analysis of Strategies and Technologies. Michael Binyon, let's bring you back in here. You mentioned NATO earlier on. You mentioned that you, I guess, hope that this will be dealt with bilaterally and that NATO's not reeled into it. However, NATO did call for that, or Turkey called for the extraordinary meeting of NATO members. They would be hoping, wouldn't they, NATO, that this would be solved bilaterally. What if it's not?
Well, if it's not, the consequences are serious, because Russia is there in Syria, and the French and Americans are bombing Syria, and clearly there is the real danger that they will start getting each other, getting in the way of each other, as it were, not only physically running into each other's planes, but they will be working at cross purposes. There was hopes that the Russian offer to work in cooperation with the French would mean that by stealth, as it were, the Russian and NATO operations against Daesh could be coordinated. That looks a bit more difficult now. And I think NATO from the start has been deeply suspicious of Russian motives in Syria, although I have to say many NATO leaders do think that the long-term Russian plan of bringing Assad to a conference table is probably the only one that is viable. Now, of course, NATO will back its own member, Turkey, in the first instance. I think there may be some fairly urgent consultations about what actually happened, but NATO will offer solidarity with Turkey while trying perhaps to defuse the situation with suggestions about how this might be now carried forward.
Gulnur Aybet, are we seeing the ominous global stakes at play if no solution to Syria is found, with the saber-rattling going on here on the border?
That's why I think, despite that we're in the middle of a very serious crisis, even before this crisis, all players, whether they be regional powers like Turkey, Iran and Saudi Arabia, or more global powers like Russia and the United States, have realized that there has to be an end game. Because not only because of how precarious the situation is with all these players on a very tight airspace, if you like, with the Russians coming in as well. I mean, this sort of thing, I think people were waiting for this to happen in a way, as soon as the Russians entered the theater of war. And it's been remarkable until now that the United States have actually avoided any confrontation with Russia in this respect accidentally. But the rules of engagement with which Turkey operated under were also very clear, and the Russians knew about that. So, but I think overall there is some hope that cool heads might prevail. Like Michael Binyon said, I think NATO will try to diffuse this within the framework of this Article 4 type meeting that was called by Turkey today, which is for crisis management, to see what can be done for both sides to step down. I think that's the way it'll be handled, regardless of Mr. Putin's very, very strong rhetoric, I think, which was more for use for the domestic political audience. Of course, he had to say something, especially after the Turkish government admitted that it was they who shot down the jet. And also for its allies in the region, including Assad and Iran. I mean, it can't appear to be a non-responsive to something like this. But I think also Russia will choose to look at this through diplomatic means. But first of all, ask some questions, which I think Turkey will be very helpful with, as to exactly what happened. And then we'll have to take it from there. I mean, these things do happen, but like I said, it's remarkable that it hasn't happened so far, given that the Russians have chosen to demonstrate their air power in a very dangerous theater of war in a way that they couldn't, say, over the Ukraine crisis. They're facing a two-front crisis at the moment, so they will also be assessing how to deal with that.
Maxim, will the Russians be rethinking their approach to both Syria and maybe even Ukraine, given that one would think that they don't want to get into a direct confrontation with NATO and the invocation of Article 5, collective defense, Russia versus the world? The Russians don't want that, do they?
We never considered these sort of things to be within the context of NATO-Russia relationship. So this was done on a bilateral basis, and the response will be done also on bilateral basis. NATO has nothing to do with that. even with due regard that Turkey is a member of NATO, but I don't believe into a strong military standoff between Russia and NATO. And I think that the Russian response will be rather asymmetrical. It will be not on the military field, but rather on economic and political and security things, regional security things. And I think that would be a sort of hybrid response, as one can see in case of Ukraine as well.
Gulnur, do you agree with that? Maybe the Russians, I don't know, cut gas to Turkey or something
Well, the
like
Russians have proven to be very expert at hybrid warfare, as we've seen with Ukraine. So I think, yes, I mean, they'll try other things. Rather, I didn't really expect them to have a military knee-jerk reaction to this at all. In fact, it took a very long time for this response to come through. And initially, on the social media, I noticed that some Russian officials had been saying in the morning that it was probably rebels who shot
Right.
down the plane.
From the ground,
From the
yes,
ground.
yes.
So they actually, as far as they could, possibly avoided pointing the finger at Turkey from the very beginning. And once Turkey admitted that it was them, they stayed silent for a while. So I think that they're thinking through very carefully about, you know, the next step of responses. So I don't think we should expect any impetuous action.
Well, we would hope so. Thank you very much, Gulnur Aybet. Thanks for sharing your thoughts with us. In Moscow, Maxim, Shepovalenko, and in London, Michael Binyon, and earlier, Emre Erşen as well joining us in studio. Thank you very much for your thoughts.